Knowing what camera settings to use when you're shooting in manual mode can be really tricky. My goal today is to walk you through the starting settings that I use so that you can be able to have a good, solid starting place for shooting outdoors when it's sunny, when it's cloudy, and for shooting indoors, and then you can fine tune from there. Let's jump in. Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. I'm your host, Rebecca Rice, and today we are talking all about the camera settings that I use when I'm shooting outdoors on sunny days, in cloudy days, and indoors. Now, before we get too far, I did want to let you know about a free class that I have just for you guys, and this is the 5 steps to launching your photography side gig. So in this class, I will help you. Maybe you have a full-time job or you're a stay-at-home mom, whatever your situation may be, and you're wanting to move from a hobbyist photographer into having an actual legit side gig. So if that's you, come join us in this class. I'm walking you through the 5 steps that you need to know to get legit and to get this thing going in the next 30 days. So you can register using the link below, and can't wait to see you there. All right, let's jump into what camera settings you could be using when you're shooting outdoors on a sunny day, outdoors on a cloudy day, or indoors. Now, to give you a little bit of refresh, I did a video last week walking through the basics of manual mode, but just in case you need a little refresh, there are 3 main settings that we're adjusting when we're shooting in manual mode. That is our aperture, or our f-stop, our ISO, and our shutter speed. And I set them in this order. I do my aperture first, and then my ISO, and then my shutter speed. And I don't touch my aperture once I set it, and from there I'm only adjusting my ISO and my shutter speed to fine tune to get the lighting that I need. Now, what I do when I'm setting my settings is I'll take an educated guess based on experience and these starting settings that I'll give you in just a second. I take a tester shot. Once I take the tester shot, I can tell that if the photo's too bright, that I need to either lower my ISO or raise my shutter speed. If my photo's too dark, then I either raise my ISO or I lower my shutter speed. When we're looking at the 2 settings, typically ISO is what I adjust for like bigger changes that I need, and my shutter speed kind of helps fine tune from there. A couple things to keep in mind about ISO and shutter speed. For ISO, you want to be careful not to go too high because then grain starts being introduced into your images. It depends on what lens that you're using, but typically once you start getting into like the 1200 range, you start to get some grain. I know the more advanced lenses allow you to go higher without any grain being introduced, but you want to kind of test out to see what your lens looks like at those higher ranges so you know where you want to try and stay under. And for shutter speed, you want to be careful not to go too low because that's when your photos get a little bit blurry, you have a hard time staying in focus, and that's just because naturally when you snap a photo, your hand shakes a little bit, and so if your shutter speed is too low, then you have a hard time keeping in focus. Or if you're shooting, young kids that have a hard time being still, then you want to make sure that your shutter speed's a little faster so that you, capture them still and not in motion. A good rule of thumb for your shutter speed is to double your focal length and make that your minimum. So if you're shooting on a 50mm lens, then you want to go no less than 1/100, okay? So 50 times 2 is 100. You want your shutter speed to be no less than 1/100. If you're shooting on an 85, I like to go no less than 1/200 when I'm shooting on my 85. So things to kind of keep in mind. Okay, so let's talk about shooting on a sunny day first. When you're outdoors and it's really, really bright, you can adjust your settings to let less light in because you don't need more light allowed into your lens because it's already bright. So I always start with my aperture first, and I set that around 2.8. That's just what I like shooting at, 2.5 to 2.8. You may like to shoot a little bit higher, a little bit, that f-stop a little bit higher if you have a hard time getting everybody in focus, whatever that may be. But set your aperture first. So I like to start with my aperture at 2.8, and then on a sunny day, I keep my ISO at 100. That's as low as it goes, and because I know I don't want to create extra light in my image by raising my ISO, because we just don't need it. So I set that ISO at 100 and then leave it. You don't touch it the rest of the session. It's super easy. From there, the only setting you have to adjust on a sunny day is your shutter speed. So if you take a tester shot and it's still too bright, then you just raise your shutter speed. So for me, I, on a sunny day, start at like 1/200 and then raise it from there as needed. And so if you take your tester and it's still too bright, raise that shutter speed as high as it needs to go to bring it in and not be as bright. Okay, so on a cloudy day, here are the settings that I usually go with. So first, again, I start my aperture typically at about 2.8. That's just what I like shooting at. I set it and I leave it for the whole session. From there, I set my ISO. Usually I started at 400. That is just like a good starting point to know if I need to raise it more or whatnot. So I'll set it at 400 and then I set my shutter speed at 1/200. So if you take your tester shot and the photo is still too dark, I'm not going to touch my shutter speed, because remember, if you lower your shutter speed, it makes it brighter. But in this case, I already have my shutter speed as low as I want it. I typically shoot on an 85mm lens. So using that double the focal length rule that I talked about earlier, that I don't want to go lower than 1/200. So I know that I'm not going to touch my shutter speed. I'm only adjusting my ISO. So let's say, I take that tester shot at 400 ISO and it's still too dark. That's when I start raising the ISO. I'll, set it to 800 and take a tester shot and see. If it's still too dark, I'll raise it a little more. So that kind of helps you understand which setting to isolate. On a sunny day, you isolate your shutter speed, and that's the one you're changing. On a cloudy day, typically you're isolating your ISO, and that's the one you're changing. Now, let's say we move indoors. This is where things get a little bit interesting. I'm going to talk about your settings without a flash. Adding flash into things is just a totally different world. So we're just gonna not focus on that. We're gonna focus on natural light. So when I'm indoors, I again start at about 2.8 for my aperture and then leave it there. I set my ISO usually at like 600 to start, just because I know not being outside, typically it needs to be a little bit higher because it's just darker inside, unless you have these like big, beautiful windows. But in most cases, shooting indoors, it's just gonna be darker. So I'll set it at like 600 and go from there. And then I set my shutter speed at 1/200. Similar to on a cloudy day, I want to put my shutter speed as low as I'm comfortable with, and then I don't touch it. So we're again isolating just the ISO. So I'm going to take that tester shot, and if I need to, I will raise the ISO to make the photo brighter. Now, do keep in mind that this is where grain can kind of be introduced if your ISO gets too high. So you want to make sure don't go too high. Depending on your lens, you'll have different like thresholds of where that is. So on something like a 50mm 1.8 or a kit lens or something like that, once you get above like 1200 ISO, it starts to get grainy, and we don't want too much grain. I know on my 85 1.4, I can go higher. Sometimes the camera body controls how high you can go without grain being introduced and whatnot. But either way, test it out and see where your ISO starts introducing some grain and stay below that. Once you get to that point, if it's still too dark, that's when you want to introduce a flash. And like I said, we're not talking about flash in this video, but that's where you can add more light and not have to worry about the grain. All right, there you have it. Those are my favorite camera settings to start with, shooting outdoors in the sun, on a cloudy day, and indoors. I hope this is helpful for you. Don't forget to hit subscribe and like this video, and we'll see you next week with more great tips.